the auction rooms, of which we would do about £1 billion a year, most of that money is cash. 5-year average of volumes in the commercial market is 52 billion. Last year it was 38 billion. Been around for 118 years. There are about 250 people in the business. Hopefully, post this election, which is looming this week, we'll see a cut in August or September.
Pre-COVID, it was probably 70% were in room, 25% were on telephones, and that's shifted hugely now.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Bricks to Riches podcast. Today I have two very special guests. They are from Allsop's Property Auction, which is the #1 auction company in the country. I have Scott Tyler, who's the CEO of Allsop's, and I have Richard Adamson, who's the senior partner, and he deals with the residential side of the business. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Nice to see you.
Now, Scott, could you tell me a bit about Allsop's? The stats, how many properties you sell per annum, how long has it been going for? Can you give me some background about it as a CEO?
Yeah, we're a partnership. We've been around for 118 years. There are about 250 people in the business. We are the #1 auctioneers in the country, both residentially and commercially. But we do lots of other things. There's about 12 business streams we have. We do valuation, capital markets, investment, rating, lease consultancy. But we are very much a transactional business. We sell about 2,850 properties a year.
Wow, that's a lot.
Which, that translates into, about 10 a day and probably about 10 every working hour. So it's a busy environment.
You said that you sell, Scott, £2 billion worth of property per annum. How does that break down in the form of 2 billion? Is that predominantly residential, commercial, industrial? What sector sells the most and how's it broken down?
Over the last 3 or 4 years, it's about 50-50 in terms of commercial to residential in our business. The auction teams would probably do over £1 billion a year, and the capital markets investment teams would do approaching £1 billion a year to equal that too.
Wow. Huge numbers, very big. Now, in relation to commercial properties, Scott, because obviously I've been in the property industry for 30 years. I started buying my first property when I was at university. Now, one thing I've observed, Scott, is that the commercial sector is slowing down as such. Where I can see a strong market is in the industrial sector and the residential sector. A, because of the fact that COVID, a lot of people don't want to travel, they like to work from home, and the businesses are saving money because they have secure IT systems and they work from home and they set their employees' targets so they don't have to pay rents or rates. So that's why the government's relaxed the planning scheme to make it PDR, so there's lots of office buildings offered to me every day as PDR schemes. And secondly, the retail sector, Scott, is dying as well because of the fact, again, because of COVID, a lot of people will go and shut their retail unit down, go and rent an industrial unit, keep the ground floor as storage and the upper floors as offices. So if you buy something, click and collect, comes next day. How do you think that will impact the commercial industry going forward for the future?
Yeah, obviously there's a lot in there. I mean, let's start with industrial and resi. A lot of people are seeing that as the safest sector at the moment, and whether it's the safest, I think it's probably the most exciting. Obviously nicknamed beds and sheds. Residentially, it's very active out there at the moment in the build to rent sector, whether that's single family or multi-family. There's a lot of investment going into that sector. It's probably the fastest growing part of the Allsop business. Together with student, there's a lot of institutions, funds who are switching from some of the traditional commercial sectors into the residential sector. So we're sort of calling them the living markets, and we manage about 5,000 of those units as well. So industrials and sheds, a lot of people are looking at those post-COVID. Obviously different shopping patterns have increased demand for warehouse space, whether it's small, medium or large, and yields fell very rapidly post-COVID because of the change in our shopping patterns. But even the industrial market has moved out after post-Trussonomics. Yields generally in property has moved out, but the industrial is a strong sector, and we're starting to see yields come back in again over the last 3 or 4 months. Now, you also touched on there about retail and office sector. And hence the increase in the PDR schemes, permitted development from offices to residential. And let's take offices.
Scott, just for the sake of the listeners, a lot of people don't know what PDR is. Obviously, you and I are in the industry. Yeah. For the layperson, what is PDR?
Permitted Development Rights, which was introduced a few years ago, and there were first iteration of that. There were some poor developments going from office to residential. You didn't have to go through a planning process. Some councils wanted to stop that change and introduced what they called Article 4 to stop some of that. There is now a second phase of this, often nicknamed 2.0 for PDR. We expect more offices to change to residential. I mean, the whole pattern of working in offices has changed post-COVID. Every business in the country has different rules and regs, whether they want staff in 5 days a week, 3 or 4 days a week, or you have to do a Monday or a Friday. The patterns we're seeing with offices, a number of people ask, are offices dead? I don't think they are. What we are seeing a shift towards is going towards super prime in offices. You've got to attract your staff back to the office, so they want better offices. Some of those offices that are poorly located, secondary, tertiary positions, maybe on some business parks that don't have amenity, they are the offices that will possibly change to residential if it's located in the right area, or even if the numbers stack up to potentially industrial. But I think to say office is dead is an overstatement. There is definitely demand for offices.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. So, Joan, when the demand for offices, obviously the demand for offices is as high as before, that means the rentals would have reduced, Scott. So are landlords doing cheaper deals?
To an extent, but some of the offices are being driven by the fact that everyone wants the best offices in town.
Yes.
And that is being driven by attracting staff back to the office, but also businesses wanting to hit their ESG targets, EPCs in terms of the rating of offices. They're having to prove to staff that they're in healthy offices for them to work and be in that environment. So, yeah, the office piece is one that has changed quite a lot over the last 3 to 4 years, particularly post-COVID. But it is fighting back because occupiers are wanting the best space for their staff.
Do you think it'll ever go back to pre-COVID level demands, or do you think it will slowly just die down and get less and less demand? Because a lot of people, the new generation, the people who are a lot younger than us, they prefer to work from home. They can't be bothered travelling to London on the tube. Let somebody come from East London, let's say from Leytonstone to Mayfair, they can't be bothered being on that tube for 1 hour. No, they could get worked on the opportunity cost.
I get that, Nabil. I think there's lots of facets that go into that decision. I think the younger generation, the 20 to 30-year-olds, for your point that you made, might want to work from home, but actually they probably learn more in the office.
Yes, I agree with
They
that.
pick up information, they get invited to meetings, and that subconscious learning is not done in your flat at home, but it will be in the office. So listen, all businesses are different. They'll all have different rules and regulations, but I think we have seen a tick up in occupancy, even in the last 6 to 12 months for most businesses that perhaps were having 2 to 3 days a week. It's now 3 to 4 days a week. Fridays is probably the problem. I think, we've seen stats and, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, occupancy is at a reasonable level, but Friday is still pretty low.
Early weekend. Yeah, and a lot of people, obviously from a developer's point of view, a lot of people like to buy industrial property or land and develop because it's a lot cheaper. You can build a shed within 6 months. You can do it for £70 to £100 a square foot. Whereas if you're doing a residential scheme in central London or let's say in Cheshire, you're looking at about £200 a square foot. So a lot of developers, from my point of view, are going towards industrial because you can get in and out a lot quicker.
Yeah, I mean, there's demand there for all the reasons of shopping and people needing warehousing space. You're absolutely right. Even the shed market has probably pushed up towards £100 a foot, but it's still significantly cheaper than residential. The other point which should be made is obviously with offices, there is potential for obsolescence in offices. Once upon a time, you were letting offices for 10 or 15-year leases, and then at the end of that 10 or 15-year lease, you would refurbish. Yes. But unfortunately now leases are a lot shorter. So tenants are only taking for 5 years, and then you're having to refurb again after 5 years. Now, that is an office problem with obsolescence. It doesn't necessarily happen with industrial sheds because you don't have that obsolescence. It's a quick sort of clean up, paint up, and then you get it relet very quickly. Whereas with offices, you have to factor in air conditioning, lifts, etc. that need to be brought up to that grade A standard.
And if you look at it from a lender's point of view, because obviously I deal with lending institutions, you deal with more selling a property, Scott. So if you want to go and buy a property and I go to, let's say, HSBC Bank and say, look, lend me money to buy an industrial unit, the bank will say yes, and they'll give me a 10-year mortgage term. Whereas if I go to buy a commercial one, as you quite rightly pointed out, Scott, they'll see the short lease of the commercial tenant and they won't have that security, so they'll only give you a 5-year loan. So the better the better quality asset, the longer term loan you get. So that surely must affect the pricing.
Yeah, and that's why generally industrial yields have hardened and offices have moved out. Once upon a time, a very good office in one of the top 6 city centres was trading at 5%.
Yes.
Your best office in a city centre these days is more mid-7s, so that has moved out. And then your industrial units trading anywhere between 5 to 6% at the moment. But a lot of it is factored in terms of that ongoing obsolescence cost, and actually, how quickly you can relet these things. And you touched on lending there. I mean, obviously, we're all waiting for this first interest rate cut. Hopefully, post this election, which is looming this week, we'll see a cut in August or September, and maybe 1 or 2 more to follow. The 5-year swap rate has come in below 4% in the last week. And obviously a lot of lending is related to that 5-year swap. All-in borrowing costs now probably into the early to mid-6s, whereas 6 months ago it was 7+. And that's all related to the yield. And a lot of people don't want to deficit finance.
Of course.
And of course, it's important with that interest rate to come down that we can get all-in borrowing costs back, hopefully to 5 to 6%, which will have an impact on yields hopefully performing and hardening.
Because let's say you're going to borrow from a bank, let's use HSBC as an example, at 6%, and then you want to have a yield at least 8 to 10% to have that buffer.
Yeah.
If you're borrowing at 6% and the yield's only 6%, there's no meat left on the bone for the investor.
Yeah, and then you're only reliant on obviously the rental growth performing, but that is you're gonna have to pick your sectors to do that. And industrial has proved over the last few years that it's had rental growth. I mean, the other area which we should just touch on is retail warehousing. It's quite popular still in the UK. A lot of investors are looking at retail warehousing. Obviously, retail as a sector has been much maligned for all the reasons we know. But out-of-town retail warehousing that perhaps is anchored by a supermarket with then a DIY store, a Wickes or a B&Q, together with Pets, together with B&M, very sought after. And the reason they're sought after is because there's only 3% vacancy in retail warehousing in the UK, which is a stat which not many people know, but it is actually driving performance in that retail warehouse market.
So, Scott, in relation to interest rates, because a lot of my followers on social media ask me questions about interest rates. And earlier we touched about this interest rate point. What do you expect? The interest rates have reduced. Will they kind of just reduce for the election, or they'll continue to go down right till the end of the year and first quarter of 25?
So obviously, hopefully Thursday out the way, we probably know which flavour we're going to get on Thursday with a Labour government. Obviously, it's outside of their jurisdiction to sway interest rates. That's down to the Bank of England. But I think it is thought of that the first interest rate cut will be either August or September. And I would expect probably another 1 or 2 before the end of the year.
So you think 0.25 each time?
Yeah, and I think...
You don't think a large reduction of 0.5?
No, I think they'll do it in...
0.25?
I think they'll do it in 0.25. And I think we'll end up going from 5.25 over the next 18 months down to about 3.5. But I don't think it's going to go lower than that.
Okay. So hopefully those are good signs for the economy, to the property market to bounce back.
Absolutely, and if you can get your all-in borrowing costs in on the commercial side that is competitive, and you have some rental growth and yields hardening, then that's going to bode well for the commercial property market. What I would say is that we've been surviving on fumes really over the last couple of years. The 5-year average of volumes in the commercial market is 52 billion. Last year it was 38 billion. So significant downside on our 5-year average. We expect this year to be sort of 40 to 42 is what so a little bit up on last year, but not rocking and rolling.
And also, when the interest rates were high, you saw the market slow down, Scott. Did you Allsop, so they see a lot of casualties like LPA receivership sales, for sales, or because I speak to a lot of bankers and they say they've got lots of assets in their books that they want to sell. They haven't sold them yet because they don't want to flood the market. And obviously they'll probably hold them now on their balance sheet if they're producing income and sell it later on. But have you, whilst the interest rates were high, did you see many casualties that were being sold for sales?
Well, it's interesting because the banks are behaving very differently this time than following the GFC. They're being a lot more amenable to their customers, working with them together. We've probably seen more on the residential side, if I'm being honest, and I'm going to refer to obviously Richard, my colleague, to talk about that later. So, in terms of residential developments, haven't seen so much on the commercial side. The banks have generally tried to work with their customers, and if they have pushed them, worked on consensual sales, the area probably where it is going to be coming to a point might be on secondary, tertiary offices, and then hopefully for obviously the borrower, they might have a PD exit. Your listeners now know what PD is. That will hopefully help them out on the office side, but it's really been residential
that suffered the most.
It's
not surprising because I would have thought it would have been the other way around, because residential people always need a roof over their head. Don't like people need to eat, drink. People always at residential properties always been quite safe.
I think there's been casualties on the buy to let front. There's also been casualties on larger scale developments, but I think on the commercial side, the casualties are possibly coming on offices, but we have seen on large shopping centres. I mean, if you think your £100 million shopping centre is no longer a £100 million shopping centre, it might only be 10 or 20 million pound shopping centre. So there's a lot of people who've had their fingers burnt in there, but might not necessarily be bank reliant. Could have been institutions and funds. But it's a fair point. It hasn't been as stark as the last time.
From a global credit crisis.
Correct.
And also, Richard, you said Allsop sells £2 billion worth of property per annum on average. After that £2 billion, Richard or Scott, with that, could you tell me how much of that is bought cash or through basically funds, and how much is that through bank funding? Do you have a breakdown of that?
Don't have a necessary breakdown, but in the auction rooms, of which we would do about £1 billion a year, most of that money is cash, and on the day it's probably 70 to 75% cash, and then they will obviously debt finance over that 6-week period. Outside of that, the capital markets, I mean, we have been dominant in that 1 to sort of 20 million market. So outside of the auction room, it's really sort of 4 million to 20 million. Again, a lot of that is cash that will be financed down the line, but will be bought with cash. The big problem we've had in the market really, and why the volumes are so low compared to the 5-year average, is the lack of the 50 to 100 million pound deals. And it's really when the debt market gets rocking and rolling again, we will then see those volumes rise and those 50 to 100 million pound deals happen again.
Okay, and when you sell properties like £2 billion a year, do the majority of your customers, are they UK based or are they international?
All over. I mean, we have a strong UK base. We've got 50,000 private investors on our database, but we have overseas investors. We've got an alliance with Millennium Group, which is our Far Eastern alliance, effectively Hong Kong, Singapore money coming into the UK. It's been quieter over the last year or two. But the Middle Eastern clients that we have, we're retained by a private bank for our Middle Eastern clients. They are buying right now. June and July, they like to go shopping in London, and they like to go shopping across the UK. So we will be busy with them, and they like offices. So it's quite interesting that they're quite comfortable with offices as long as they get 8, 10, 12-year income.
Because a lot of Middle Eastern people I transact with, Scott, they say to me, well, we're parking our money now in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, or let's say Dubai, because obviously they think that Saudi Arabia is going to be the next superpower, the way they're investing so much money in developing it. So have you not seen a shift in the investment in the UK? because of Saudi Arabia or Dubai?
I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, obviously there's lots of countries around the world that have attraction to certain types of investor. What I would say is that the UK, for all the self-inflicted wounds it's put upon itself over the last 7 or 8 years, is still attractive to a number of overseas investors. Indeed, we've suddenly seen an influx of French money coming in. Now that might be because of their elections. They're veering to the right. They're a bit concerned.
And it's close. It's half an hour to get to America.
A hop across the water, isn't it? But so there's always a new influx of investors from across the world, and I would say that we are still seen as a pretty safe haven for investment.
And also, Scott, from my personal point of view, being in the property industry for 30 years, it's been very good to me and my family. One thing I can say that UK is a very mature economy. So I've seen 3 recessions, I've seen the whole business cycle, and I can see it's a safe, secure economy. Whereas if you go to somewhere like Saudi Arabia or Dubai, for example, it's immature. It hasn't got the experience like the UK has. Do you agree?
No, I totally agree with that. It is a mature market. People have been buying and selling in this market for a long time. As I say, we've been around for nearly 120 years doing it for people. So it's a mature market compared to some of the what we call young upstarts around the world.
Exactly. And also, the other question I've got on my list here for you, Scott, is when do you think the property market will bounce back to the original glory it was before the interest went high? And the other question is, Scott, what do you think is the best sector? Let's say if you had a client come to you and said, Scott, I've got £100 million here and I want to buy property. I'm going to retire, sell my business. I've got £100 million cash in the bank. I'm going to invest my property. And this is one of your known clients. And you said, would you tell them to invest in commercial, industrial, residential? What do you do? So 2 questions. When do you think the property market will bounce back to its original glory? And where would you advise someone to park their money today? If someone knocked on your door and said, I want to invest now, I'm 60, I want to enjoy the rest of my life just collecting rent.
No, interesting question. I mean, I think bounce might be too strong a word. I think we're already seeing an improvement in the market. I think we need to get this election out of the way. We need to have a couple of interest rate cuts to get the market moving. So I think it will be a gradual process over the next 6, 9, 12 months. And we just hope there's no other black swan event, of which we seem to have one on an annual basis over the last 7 or 8 years. So outside of that, I think the fundamentals in the UK are strong. I think we've seen a shift from a number of people going from commercial markets who've lost money in offices and retail, go into residential. So I think in your £100 million spend, you'd need to have access to some residential markets, whether that's build to rent.
How much do you break it down, Scott?
I think
what percentage?
I would look at over the next sort of 5-10 year performance. I'd probably be looking at 40% into my residential pot of some sort, whether that's in build to rent or student or senior living. I think on my commercial pot, with that other sort of 60%, I'd be quite strong in industrials because I see the performance for all the reasons we've already discussed, backed by sort of retailers storing a lot of goods, etc. That's how retail has gone and is going. I would also look at some of maybe the alternative sectors, so like day nurseries where you can get long income for secure income. Then you might look at sort of a Travis Perkins sort of hybrid type shed retail unit. And then there's retail warehousing, which I touched on earlier, very small vacancy in retail warehousing. And that is going to drive performance and growth. I don't like to exclude offices, but I need to get my head around more about just the total cost of obsolescence and how that filters through to what the current yield should be. And I think we're learning about that on a day-by-day basis.
And it depends on the quality of the tenant for the office. So, for example, you've got the Secretary of State on a 25-year lease with no break, that's a no-brainer.
Correct. But you don't often get that these days. As I say, most leases are sort of 5 to 10.
And also, Scott, because you deal with the whole of the UK.
Yeah.
So would you, that client who came to you with £100 million, would you say to him, just park your money in London, or would he spread the money across globally, like some in Manchester, some in London, some in Birmingham, some in the Isle of Man? Where would you park that gentleman?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd always have to park some in London. Saying what I've said about offices, there is a big London office market in the City and West End, which has had a hard time. Now, many would see that as a good time to buy at the moment, and that might be your final 10 or 15% of your pot would be in offices in London, because I think they are towards the bottom.
Yeah.
But I think you would have a national spread. I mean, there is still a premium for investing in the southeast, because fundamentally a lot of investors are lazy and they don't want to go too far out the southeast. But if you do explore up to the northeast, northwest and Midlands, you do get a little bit more for your money in terms of yield, because you just have less people wanting to invest in there.
And the capital value, the buying price is a lot less.
Correct.
You could buy, for example, a house in Burnley for about £50 per square foot, whereas if you want to buy a place in central London, you're looking at least £1,500 to £2,000 a square foot. Huge difference.
There is, yeah. I mean, another thing that we've looked at over the years, when I first started, I've been in this business for 34 years. I joined as a graduate at Savills in 1990. I've been at Allsop for the last 18 years, trying to grow that investment piece of the business alongside auctions. But when I visited cities 34 years ago, the likes of Birmingham, the likes of Manchester, they weren't great places to be. 34 years on, they are fantastic places to live and work.
If you look at Manchester, because originally I'm from Manchester, Scott, if you look at Manchester, before it used to be London number 1, then Birmingham number 2, then Manchester. Now Manchester's overtaken Birmingham.
Yeah.
And the best thing that ever happened to Manchester was, sadly, that IRA bombing. I don't know if you remember that.
1996,
Yeah.
I was selling a building in Balloon Street, Manchester.
Balloon Street.
And the bomb went off,
Yeah.
and I had no windows in my office building that I was selling. But as
Fortunately,
you say,
nobody got hurt.
nobody got hurt, but it was one of those things that
It's a
actually
blessing in
transformed
disguise. Yeah.
Manchester.
That facelifted the whole city.
Correct.
And it regenerated the city. So that's been the best thing for Manchester. So I agree with you. Spread, so hedge the bet, that £100 million, spread it across the country.
Across various sectors
Yes.
and across the country.
Okay, so another question. I know you're not a politician. It's more than likely Labour will win the general election. And if Labour do win the election, how do you think it'll affect the property market? Like people saying, like for example, I've got children, they go to school, I have to pay tax on the school fees. How do you think it will affect the tax of the property industry and the performance? Because obviously they want to create equal wealth, Labour do. So how will that affect, because the property market is highly capital intensive, so you need a lot of capital. So they want to make first time buyers, for example, everybody just have a property, they want to help people. How do you think that will change the landscape of property?
So just before you answer that, Neil, could you repeat the same question again without the ending, so just a short question, just because you covered it now. It's a great social club, that's all.
Okay.
So just from
Labour.
the effects of Labour, and then go straight to the answer.
Okay, so Scott, we've got the general election coming up. More than likely Labour will win. Now, how do you think that will change the landscape of the property industry? Because they're going to make it equal. The goal of Labour is to try and make equal opportunity for everybody and not have a division of wealth. So surely that will affect the property industry going forward. What's your view about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in years gone by, the Labour Party, then you might be frightened about what they might do for business, particularly in the property market. But let's face it, on a scale of 1 to 10, we've got a Labour Party that's probably ranked about 4 or 5 on that scale, and probably not dissimilar to what we have currently. I think what I want to see from the Labour government going forward is for them to sort out the planning system. The planning system is broken in this country. Nothing's getting built, whether it's residential or it's sheds or anything commercially, but particularly residential. They've come out, they want to build 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. We've got to get on with it. We are short of housing in every sector, whether it's for young people, for students, for middle-aged people, for senior living, for care. It's broken, and actually the planning system hasn't helped. So if they can unlock that with whatever policies they've got, great. Rachel Reeves has come out to be quite business friendly, reasonably, but the proof will be in the pudding. I guess, without getting political, if there's a huge majority, then there may be concerns that the left have more persuasion. But I think this is a very different potential Labour government than what was on offer 5 years ago under Jeremy Corbyn.
The only thing I see, Scott, as a developer, is that the planning, if you put a planning application in, the planners always say on the website, take 12 weeks for a small extension, a bigger one, maybe 6 months. on large schemes where we're 99 apartments, and I put a planning application in like Aylesbury, Luton, Cheshire, Trafford, it's always taken me 2-3 years. And now that 2-3 years is a huge time, the opportunity cost, the cost of holding the asset, that slows everything down.
I agree. And that, as I raise it as a problem, that is fundamentally a problem that they have to resolve.
The red tape. There's a lot of red tape.
Yeah, and people can be cynical about it, that post-COVID, many are still working from home and not going into the council offices anymore, having those chats, trying to get things over the line. Things get lost in the red tape, and they've got to change it.
Okay, thank you. And another question, Scott, is industrial versus residential. This is one question lots of my followers ask me. So if you had a choice, going back to that £100 million scenario case study, if you had to park money in industrial or residential, that 100 million, one choice, which one would you go for?
Beds and sheds. I'd love to do both.
But if you only had one choice?
I've got one choice. Listen, my background is commercial.
Yeah.
I know commercial more than residential, hands on the table. But fundamentally, we are short of housing in this country.
Yes.
And therefore, although I'm no residential expert, I've got to be looking at that residential market and thinking that's where the performance is going to be, because we haven't got enough of it.
So lots of people are acquiring, like developers, I've acquired a lot of green land, greenbelt land. So eventually that greenbelt land will be granted planning, because the only thing we're running short of land, we can only go taller, we can't go wider, can we?
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely 100% not a supporter of building on greenbelt land, because it's sacrosanct and it's there for a reason. What frustrates me is that there's a lot of brown belt land. I think anybody in the country can picture in their hometown or city that land that was once an old garage or bus station or an old industrial unit that's no longer fit for purpose. Now that is the land that should be being built on if it's located in a reasonable location, and get that built before we start looking at any grey land or green land.
And what about delay in building, Scott? For example, if you go to a site in Dubai, for example, because I've got property in Dubai, over there, you go there, Scott, they turn around a site very quick. It's a 24-hour construction scheme. It works 7 days a week, and they do 3 8-hour shifts. Over here, as you're aware, people work Monday to Friday, and they work 8 till 4, 5 days a week. Do you think we can speed up the developments in the UK? For example, let's say if I was doing a development at Mayfair and I was doing 100 apartments, it will take me 2-3 years to build it. Whereas if the same was in downtown Dubai, it'll be done in 6 months. Is there any way of speeding up the development?
I'm not sure there is, and long term, you've just got to extend people's hours and incentivize people to work quickly. And I think that's down to obviously individual companies to reward their staff and make sure they are rewarded. I mean, that's a whole different topic about how people are paid, whether in the UK or in Dubai. But that's a big one, and probably not one I have expertise on.
Okay, and one last question before we go to Richard is that, since like Russian money's gone out of England and lots of foreign money cannot come to UK because of all the embargo tax implications, have you seen that affect people buying property with Allsops or not?
Yeah, I mean the dynamic has changed. I mean with Russian money, whether it's residential or commercial, obviously there's anti-money laundering is far more in the focus now than it perhaps was 5 or 10 years ago. And it has affected obviously the London residential markets, and Richard will probably touch on that as well in terms of the performance of the London markets. But just on residential, again, people sort of look at, there aren't so many Chinese buyers or Russian buyers anymore, but fundamentally London as a centre is still quite expensive for the average worker. If the average wage is £44,000 a year in London and your average flat is 525, 550, that's well over 10 times your salary, and you need a big deposit. So, the London market to some will still be seen as very expensive. It's just not being rocket fueled by the Russians and the Chinese anymore.
So, Scott, one final question to you, my friend, is that I have a lot of affluent people as my friends, colleagues, family friends, like doctors, lawyers, businessmen from different sectors, and they always ask me, Nabil, we want to buy property, what would you recommend? What advice would you give the next generation of property developers? Obviously, in 20 years' time, you and I will retire. There'll be a new generation of property developers. What advice would you give them from your 30-year plus experience? Between us, we've got 60 years experience.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, what advice would you give the next generation?
I think the next generation, you've got to always look at location. Has to be location. Always look at something you can afford. Don't overstretch yourself. We've seen the problems we've had with that in the past. And also diversify your portfolio. I think we touched on earlier, actually, don't put all your eggs in one basket, whether that's residential or commercial. I think in the UK, we have had a fixation about bricks and mortar over the years. Everyone wants to try and own their own home. 20 years ago, everyone wanted to have a buy-to-let. Now, I think property is still understood. People do like to touch, feel these things, go and see them. They perhaps understand it a little more than investing in the NASDAQ or Dow Jones or the FTSE 100. So there isn't a sort of a British,
isn't it? It's more
there's a British obsession, and I think overseas investors too, have an affinity into this safe haven in the UK. So I would say location, don't overstretch yourself, and diversify.
I agree with you. However, me being in property for over 30 years, I used to do location all the time. As a younger man, I was obsessed with Central London. I used to live in Mayfair. I had lots of assets around Mayfair, Belgravia. But I think location's good, but more importantly for me now, it's all about pricing. I only buy distressed assets. If it's not cheap enough, I want to buy. So I'll buy in Birmingham if the deal is right. I'll buy in Luton. I'll buy in Mayfair. I'll buy anywhere as long as I'm buying at the right price.
Sure.
Because obviously my business model for me as an individual, I have to add value. So I'll only buy today if I can sell tomorrow for a profit. But if you're a long-term holder and you're just not going to sell it, then I agree with your location.
No, understood. But I think we're agreed that you diversify across the UK.
Yes. Okay, Scott, I know you're very, very busy. You've got £2 billion worth of property to sell.
I hope.
You're the CEO of Allsop, and I really appreciate you making time to come on the Bricks to Riches podcast.
Nabil, absolute pleasure. Thank you for interviewing.
And hopefully we can do lots of business together.
Let's hope so.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
So, Richard, you are the head of residential property auctions and you're one of the auctioneers.
That's correct, yes. I mean, my career over 20 plus years has predominantly been in the residential auction side of the business, and I'm one of the partners and auctioneers there, and recently I've become managing partner of the whole residential division, so I oversee that part of the business now.
And what sector of that £2 billion that your colleague Scott was talking, how much of that was residential per annum?
As Scott mentioned before, it's a reasonably even split. I mean, it dovetails a little bit depending on what the market's generally doing. From an auction perspective, we have two bespoke auction teams, which is one of the many unique things about Allsop. So we don't have one auction house, residential, commercial, put together. We, for decades, have separated that out. So we have a specialist commercial auction team, and they hold about 7 or 8 auctions a year. And then we have a dedicated residential auction team, which I'm involved with, and we have, at the moment, 10, 11 auctions a year. Whilst there's, again, you and Scott alluded to it, the market's so much more fluid than it was when I first started 20 years ago. There were commercial investors, there were residential investors, and never twain would meet. That's not the case anymore. There's people like yourself, and you mentioned you were talking to Scott, that are deal driven. If the deal's right, commercial, residential, mixed use, it's right for you. So there's a lot of crossover between the two teams and the buyer pools and the seller pools.
Okay, and also one thing, Richard, I observed from property auctions growing up. As a child, when I used to go to my family's in the property business, I used to go to Allsop's auction, and we used to bid with holding a paddle, put a number down and bid and compete against everybody. But now, with the modern times, everything's gone digital. You have to register your bid, you have to go through money laundering online, pay token money, and then bid. How's that changing the future of the property industry and residential auctions, or any auction for that matter?
That's a very good question, and it's what's changed really is the two things there you picked up on there, which actually accelerated the change of property catching up with technology, if you like. I think pre-COVID, property was probably one of the slowest businesses to follow and benefit from technology. It was old-fashioned, as you say, paper catalogues turn up to an auction, sales particulars, the way things were transacting. COVID accelerated that hugely, and as did compliance. And it was around about the same time whereby the anti-money laundering regulations came into play for all transactions. Where it became particularly challenging for auctions in that sphere of KYC and AML was that HMRC deemed that you must do those checks at the forming of a business relationship. And it was key to trying to define what that business relationship was for auctions, because we have a binding contract on the fall of the hammer, you must go through the process with all buyers and bidders to do that, because you might be entering into a business relationship at the drop of the gavel. So that meant we had to register all the buyers, which meant we had to kind of store all that information and deal with it. And that then pretty much a year later coincided with COVID. We as a business had a commercial auction catalogue and a residential auction catalogue out in the market when we went into lockdown. We had something like 500 properties on the market, all due to be at the Berkeley Hotel and the Park Lane Hotel 2.5 weeks later. So we had to very quickly switch our business during that period without cancelling 2 auctions and move it online, which we did. We helped some suppliers as well to do that. So in answer to your question, that process could have taken 3, 4, 5 years had we so wished, but we didn't have the choice. We had to get online. We had to follow the regulations. And so that's really how it's changed an awful lot. I think the other thing to point out there is there's been a bit of a generational shift. And what I mean by that is the generations, the future of property buyers and sellers, if you like, particularly in the professional sector, that will be from 20 to 40 years old, are very used to buying all sorts of products, cars, shopping online, properties, on their phones, whether it's bidding online, phone calls, or whatever it might be. And they don't necessarily see the value that your generation or my generation saw in being in a room, an auction room, where you could see how much things were selling for. You could feel if the market was good or not just by watching good news. You could feel it's tangible in an auction room. They don't have interest in that. You know, they want to spend their time doing other things and rather spend 5 minutes bidding and move on to things. So that whole evolution of auctions has been accelerated in a 4-year period very quickly because of COVID and because of compliance.
So people can save time, the benefit of online auctions. The auctioneer saves money on renting the room and the catalogue, the paperwork, because it's gone paperless in effect. And then also people from abroad can bid now. So let's say if you've got someone in France, they could bid on a property auction sat in Paris.
Yeah,
Before you'd have to physically come to the auction and bid, or you could do telephone bidding, couldn't you?
I mean, it depends how far you go back.
Yeah.
I mean, from 2010 through to 2020, and beyond that, to be honest with you, people could bid by phone and people could bid by the internet. Pre-COVID, it was probably 70% were in room, 25% were on telephones, and that was growing actually year on year, and then a very small few online. That's shifted hugely now. We went back to the auction room last year 3 times. And there were a lot of people that did turn up, but not on the volumes that we were used to in terms of people turning up in the room. I mean, it has to be said, that came at a time during those interest rate rises where the pool of buyers was really thin. But buyer behaviours had shifted. You were talking about earlier with Scott in terms of retail, the high street shifted. Well, so is the behaviour within auction rooms. People want to bid by phone or on internet more than ever before. So we have to adapt to that and provide them with the best platform to do that.
Do you think it'll shift even further going further in the future? For example, each property would have a 3D video done by a professional independent body, and so they could see everything of the property inside and outside, saves them time to view the property. At the moment, there's a legal pack loaded online, but let's say there'll be a structural survey loaded online. There'll be a online exchange of contracts. Everything will be done digitally. Do you think that will happen in the future? So somebody doesn't have to even talk to anybody. You just put in your bid online, you type in your card detail, transfer the money, and you formally exchange. So it's a 3D video. Everything's there. Valuation. There'll be a risk charter evaluation by an independent body. There'll be a structural survey. So then, in effect, everything will be digitalised. AI world, as you call it.
Yeah, the short answer to your question is no, I don't. But the longer-winded answer of that is I think it will sit somewhere in the middle. Property is a people business, and relying on AI and technology should speed that process up for you, so it's more efficient for you. And I think that's the real benefit to it. But you as an investor, and a large portion of us, they want to go and see the property. You might get a nice tour of the property, and then you turn around and realise the building opposite's being reclad. It's got builders there for 2.5 years. So you want to go down there and feel it, or the neighbour's not very nice, whatever it might be. You want to be there, feel it, and see it. Don't get me wrong. I think international investment in new build property, residential property in the UK has often been remote. But then again, they're relying on agents advising them. They've been there, they've seen it as a good investment. So I think I can't see it, but times change. I can't see it ever getting that automated, but I think there are benefits to be had by automating and speeding processes up for people.
Can you just say that again? So about the automating, because I can't see it, and then the just because that noise?
I can't see it being fully automated in my lifetime, but things change quite quickly. I think the benefit really is that it will speed processes up, make people be able to make decisions quicker, so more efficient with their time. But ultimately, we'll want that human interaction.
Okay. And also, doing Allsop's property auction, you cover the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's lots of auction houses across the country. There's regional ones like Edinburgh, Pugh and Company, Savills, Reeves Rains. Now, somebody who's selling a property, for example, in Manchester, and the property is in Manchester, why would they appoint Allsop's? Why would they not go to a local auction house? Why do you differ from the rest?
That's a very good question, and it's one since I started over 20 years ago. It's been debated widely. But I would say to you, as you said yourself, there's a lot of investors out there that are deal-driven, and they're not just sticking to their location. I think that's more than ever before. 20 or so years ago, often advice would be stick to what you know, the area you know, where you live, what you're familiar with. It's too much risk going further afield. A large proportion of buyers don't feel that way now. If they're chasing yield or if they're chasing add value opportunities, they will go further afield from where they live. It's quicker and easier to travel around. The technology's there already for things like high-level looks on Street View, Google, imagery, for people to make reasonably informed decisions depending on their risk appetite. So what I'm saying to you is that there are buyers in London, the South East, that will buy all over the country, and they're not going to necessarily trawl through hundreds of different auctioneers' catalogues. I think the last time we checked, there's 167 different property auctioneers in the residential sector. Very difficult to look through it. So from our perspective, which is why you see our catalogue full of regional properties, is that if you get your marketing and your advertising and the exposure of the property itself and the wider auction right, and that costs a lot of money, you've got to invest in it, you will get the best price. And that is, I believe, why people come to us. You can cut corners, spend less on advertising, marketing, not have an auction venue. If you don't reinvest that into getting the best price, you won't.
So you offer transparency and fairness to both customer and buyer. So you think that's why you get people coming to you across the country?
I think there's a number of reasons. That's definitely one of them. It's the belief that there's a wider market here. You guys were talking earlier about international investment. Well, you get a little bit of that at auctions. Yeah. At the wider it's a bit like fishing. You throw a big trawler net out there, you'll catch a lot of fish, and that's how our marketing attitude is. It's go high and wide as far as you can, which costs a lot of money and takes time. But if you get an extra bidder for each lot, I might get you £2,000, £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 more, which is what my job is, to get best price for you.
And the best is getting two people bidding against the same plot, then you're happy days.
Absolutely. If you get one more bidder or one more bid, it's you that's smiling because it's your property. And the other thing is, Scott alluded to it and you did on the introduction there, as a business, we've been around almost 120 years. We are most famous for auctions, it's a very high profile part of our business. And we have the most experienced people in the property industry and in auctions in the whole country. And why not tap into that as a buyer or seller?
Okay. And also, a lot of people, some people are nervous going to auctions because they've never been there. Like I've spoken to people before, Richard, who have been to property auctions and they bought stuff. And I said, have you reviewed the legal pack? The novices said, sorry, what's that? So do you tell every single customer to review the legal pack before bidding, or some people just think you just go and bid? And secondly, the other thing, Richard, a lot of people go and bid an auction thinking they're getting a deal. Now, when I've done my comparables and due diligence, sometimes an auction, because you're competing with somebody else, you're actually paying just as much as the market price, if not more. So there's a misconception that you're getting a deal. What's your view on those 2 points?
I think you're absolutely right. You're a seasoned professional and have bought and sold through auctions throughout your life.
Yes.
But without question, the most important thing, or a bit of advice I'd give to potential investors that aren't familiar with auction is do your research. Once that hammer goes down, it's a legally binding contract in law. You've exchanged. That's it. No going back. So you must use that time from the catalogue being released and the marketing campaign beginning, doing all your due diligence, whether that's viewing it, whether that's doing comparables like you would do, whether that's speaking to a solicitor to review the legal pack, and also speak to the auctioneer. A lot of information they'll have and they can talk to you or guide you on it. But it's absolutely imperative to do your due diligence before you click the button or put your hand up and bid. And you're right, sorry, you was two-part quick question to that. We call them multi-channel auctions so that you can bid, in the days being in person, but now online, on the phone and by proxy. Sometimes that's convenience for people, depending if they're flying out the country or they can't be contacted, but also it accommodates the people that don't feel comfortable in certain environments, want to be on the phone or on the internet and don't like that sort of interaction with people. So, and that's why back in the day when we were in the auction rooms, we provided a lot of that for people who felt nervous and uncomfortable. The other sort of third point you made there is, a property is worth different numbers to different people. And that's what our job is to find the true value of something. And something that's worth X to you might be worth Y to somebody else. And that's the fun of property, isn't it? It's finding out what people are prepared to pay.
So that's a myth, Richard. That's what I'm saying. People think going to property auction, you're getting a deal. It's not necessarily the case.
No, it's like any trade. I mean, you're probably the best person set to say that. You must have bought some really good deals at auction before, but also bought some really good deals private treaty. Yes. Deals are deals. Exactly. Looking at the numbers, not the method of sale.
It's buying at the right price, irrespective of which method you go down, whether it's private treaty or auction.
Exactly right.
And many times I've actually bought private treaty, Richard, and sold at auction. And vice versa.
Yeah, vice versa. It's a numbers game, isn't it?
So it's all about buying at the right price for me.
Yeah.
Okay, and then also the other point I like to tell the listeners is that when you go to buy an auction, make sure you've got the funding ready. It's not like going to buy a private treaty, you agree a purchase price, your solicitor gets a contract, then go and apply for your mortgage. In this case, generally people only have 28 days to complete. So you have to go quick, bang, bang, bang. A lot of people who are novices, they ring me up, I bought this property at auction, I haven't got the money, I need to put 2 months. Then I'm introducing to the likes of Together Finance. But people need to be more organised. Do you advise your customers to have the funding ready before they bid?
Absolutely. First and foremost, we put, as you might expect, on our website, there's videos, there's guides to buying and selling at auction, but also call us. We're really experienced people to help you through it. And you're absolutely right. When I say broadly do your due diligence, part of that really is making sure you have the funds for 10% deposit and to complete. Because you're right, there are some lenders, the lending market's changed a lot in 10, 20 years. It's much more fluid. But you don't want to get to the point of completion of the funds because you risk losing your deposit. So you're absolutely right to raise that. You should have your funds in place. You were telling Scott earlier about the proportions in the auction room of cash and debt. I think Scott's right. Probably 90% of our buyers will buy with cash.
Yes.
But then just finance afterwards. So they have the luxury to do that. And then there'll be a small percentage that contacts us trying to do surveys and whatnot before completion. That's a highly risky strategy in my view.
I agree. It's too risky. You could lose your deposit.
Well, if you've got, like you've got good relationships with lenders and whatnot, and you think, well, actually, I can do that in 4 weeks, I'm comfortable. But if you're new to the game, you haven't got those relationships, you need to be careful.
I can do it within a week. God's been kind to me. Yeah. But it's taken me 30 years to get to that.
Yes.
Okay, and also, from my experience, Richard, whenever I sell a property, I always like to sell it in auction. The reason why I like to sell an auction, the deal's done there and then, so you're getting the money in a month. Whereas if you go to private treaty, sometimes a transaction could take 6 to 9 months. It's happened before, where I've issued a contract and there's delays, the buyer's getting the money, getting the mortgage, whereas the auction method is a lot cleaner sale. It's a lot tangible, a lot more transparent. So I'm always a big fan of auctions personally.
Yeah, I think the benefits, don't get me wrong, there's no perfect method of sales. It's got to work on what you do, but it's the word certainty that we use. And you as a buyer and a seller, there are certain buyers saying, look, I need to deploy £500,000 because I'm going to get a tax bill or I'm going through a divorce, whatever it might be, I need to deploy it now. Well, the buyer's got the certainty. If I'm the highest bidder on that day, I can deploy the capital. The same applies to you as a seller. I know for my cash flow, for returning loans, whatever it might be, that on this day, if I get the pricing right, I'm going to realise that money. And it's really important to people.
Okay. So do all your buyers have the clientele? Out of all your transactions, do you ever have anybody who fails to complete? It must happen in a few cases.
It does, yeah, it does. I mean, proportionally, considering how many transactions we do, it's very low. So, I'll talk purely residential. Last year, we did just over 1,600 transactions last financial year. And I guess I would say less than 10 wouldn't complete. Bearing in mind the sellers have got deposit, and that's they go back to auction, but they've got some money there as well. But it's very small margins.
So 10 who don't complete, then they forfeit their deposit.
Correct.
And they've lost the money, and then the vendor, if they sell it in the next auction, and the seller, let's say, for £100,000 less, can sue that buyer for the difference.
Absolutely right. So first things first, what we do, and I know you know this inside out, it's for your listeners' benefit really, but there's many different auctioneers out there. What we do is we make sure all buyers are fully registered, and that isn't just the AML checks. You then do a card hold, as you know before, £10,000 card hold, and that's to protect our sellers, so that we know that anyone that's bidding has got some money, they put some money down, and they're de-risking that chance of that happening.
Defaulting.
Exactly that. So we get very low defaults. Other auctioneers don't do it, and they probably got high default levels in terms of people walking away from transactions. But you're absolutely right. If you fail to complete, you risk losing your deposit, and the seller can pursue you for any loss they suffer. Yeah, absolutely right.
So really, people must do that. Must not know the auction industry. Must not know how to transact at auction.
Yeah, I mean, it happens from time to time. We do, we have a lot of touch points with buyers, whether it's on viewings or phone calls or getting them registered. And we also put on our website, say, buyers guides, click here to find out more. They try and educate the public to make sure that doesn't happen to people.
And Rich, another question. If you've got a transaction of high value, people generally, say if it's a £10 million property, like I had a property in Kensington, Prince of Wales Terrace, I sold that at an auction, but generally speaking, high value properties don't sell on auction, do they? People to put them private treaty with Allsop, and then you'll advertise it in a different forum. It's not really done on an auction contract, is it?
I think I'd flip that on its head, because that is, we talked about it, and you put it down questions there, sort of dispelling some myths of auction.
Yes.
Two biggest myths, I would say, are that auction's a last resort. It's not. It can be a very good last resort, but it can often be a first resort to maximise value. The other one is on lot size, and what I would say is, it depends. What we try to do is, before we decide and advise clients and say, is it private treaty, is it auction, is who's your buyer? What's the buyer profile likely to be? And that will determine whether it's auction or private treaty. The reason I say that, our commercial auction guys sold a lot a month or so ago for 10.8 million under the hammer. The largest lot I can recall being sold at auction was 20 million. But you're right, in the main, the bigger lot sizes tend not to. This depends on your buyer profile. If it's a cash buyer, always will be, whether it's private treaty or auction, then you could probably do auction. If there's going to be someone raising debt and it's a big transaction to do and they're pooling money from overseas and what have you, it's probably a private treaty transaction.
What's the biggest transaction you've ever done in auction residential?
12.4.
Have you?
Yeah, we sold, it was just before COVID, and it was to Rickmansworth. And it was two big office buildings that had permitted development rights in place. Mitch ended up selling it to a third building on there. Beautiful buildings, actually. They weren't traditional offices, and he owned the rest of the estate and wanted to own the entirety of it. So there are some big transactions, but you're right. Generally speaking, the bigger ones don't. But I always go back to, think of your buyer profile. If your buyer profile can't fit within the auction parameters and the timeframes, then it's not for auction. Okay. And the one you described there, a high-end flat in central London where you'll probably get a premium from an end user not building profit in, that's not for us. But if you say, well, actually, I've got a prime flat, but I want to be in and out in 3 months. Yeah,
then auction's a good one.
There you go, yeah.
Okay, I'll just check some other questions, Richard. Yeah, what's the biggest success story you've ever had from residential auctions in your career, from any of your clients?
That's a tough question. Biggest success stories. I mean, we've been the largest No.1 auctioneers for decades, and I've been involved in Allsop for 23 years. So that in itself for me is a big achievement. As I mentioned before, there's 167 auctioneers out there. It's a very, very fiercely competitive market. And to remain No.1 in the market as we do, and to maintain those high standards that we do and employ the people we do, I think is the biggest achievement, I'd say, that I can remember, rather than a single transaction or a single client.
Good. And another point of view from a buyer who goes and bids at the auction, a lot of people talking about when they're novices, they'll go and bid, even though they've looked at the legal pack, they don't know anything about buyer's premium, stuff like that. And then they're surprised, well, I bid this much, the auctioneer hit me with a £2,000 buyer premium. Do you advertise that before or after?
Yeah, we do, and I think that is, again, a good thing to pick up on. With so many different auctioneers out there, there isn't necessarily an industry standard. We try to be deemed as the best in the business.
Because some auctioneer could charge £10,000 buyer premium.
Precisely. So
and then the legal pack, when they're bidding in the auction, sometimes the vendor could put a small print, pay my legal cost 20 grand, when the legal cost could be 2,000, and the lawyer might be the mate and say, okay, give me this money back as a commission. So people sometimes don't read the small print.
Which is why, first and foremost, if those sorts of things happen, you should talk to trading standards, quite frankly. We've got a duty to be fair to people, to be fair to customers, and that's what we take a lot of pride in. So it goes back to the point I made towards the beginning of our chat, is that your due diligence and research is key. And speaking to the auctions there, on our website, it will say if there's a buyer's fee for each lot, which there is, £17.50 buyer's fee, administration fee. The other point you point out is crucial, is that as part of that legal pack that could be downloaded from an auctioneer's website, or certainly should be, there'll be a manner of documents that you might not understand as non-property people, but one document you should definitely read.
Special conditions.
Exactly, special conditions. And they're effectively a document whereby the seller's deviating from a standard auction contract. And it's usually 2 or 3 pages. And if the seller wants to pass off any of their costs on to you, that is the place where they have to illustrate that. It's key that you read that.
And do you advise all your buyers to do that? Yeah.
Absolutely, but we also go a step further because I don't think, we deal with huge volumes, but we don't think it's particularly palatable for a lot of people if sellers are putting huge costs onto a buyer. If it's £1,000 towards my legal fees or whatever it might be, people will kind of take that. But if it's tens of thousands, like you say, it's not right. So we have an independent firm that goes through most of our legal packs to look at some of that stuff in the special conditions. And if I ever see things like that, I'll be on the phone and speaking to our clients saying this is not acceptable. But it's ultimately it's down to them to do that, but we try and keep an eye on it as best we can.
Good. And really, it's up to the lawyer. If they check the legal pack, their lawyer should advise them.
If they do it beforehand, which, as you point out, is not always the case.
And also, Richard, your clientele who buy your properties in your residential auction, are they investors? Are they experienced property people? Are they corporate entities, or is it a mixture?
It's a real mix, much like our selling clients. Our clients are the sellers, ultimately they pay our fees. And I'm talking residential and commercially, it's very, very, very diverse, the sort of properties we sell. And what I mean by that is in both commercial and residential teams, we'll sell anything from retail, offices, mixed-use buildings, sites, developments, flats, houses, vacant investments, ASD. Everything all manner there. It could be from £5,000 to, as we discussed, £12.5 million. It's the weird and the wonderful. In terms of the sellers we deal with in the residential sector, housing associations, councils, banks, receivers, all manner, property companies, traders like yourselves, all sorts of people there. And in the commercial sector, it's very similar in terms of the seller profiles. They'll deal with a lot more funds, probably property companies. And they're actually, a lot of those people are the buyers as well. So we'll deal with private investors that buy, we'll deal with property companies, opportunistic buyers, end users in residential sometimes if they're particularly liquid and can do it. So it's a wide selection of people, and it'll be domestic and international.
As long as they perform.
Exactly, yeah, as long as they perform.
And also, when you're selling properties in your auction, residential auction, how do you prepare your clients? Let's say if I want to sell something, because 90% of the time when I speak to an auctioneer, whether it's Allsop or anybody, you always tell the vendor a lower expectation, because obviously you want to hit your reserve price and you want to create the interest. There's no point putting full value on. And then that must be a difficult task to educate a vendor, because whenever I've spoken to your team, I think, I'm just going to give it to a local agent, because obviously it's about 20-30% less.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to sell their properties for cheap. So you've got a tough job there, educating the customer, your client.
Yeah, absolutely right, Nabil. And it's a lot of those sellers that I broadly identified there, the profiles of those, a large proportion of those aren't necessarily emotional sellers. They will be led by the market, whether it's a housing association, a council, a lot of, not all, but a lot of those sellers there. So they'll trust in the process and trust in that price because time is just important for them. But you're right, for the for individuals that we're talking to, our first hurdle is to educate them in the timings, how auctions work, and the most key point there, as you mentioned, is pricing.
That's a tough job.
And it is a tough job, but when you've been doing it long enough, it's something you can do quite quickly. And to be honest, it's very hard. If I don't think I can get a price for you, I'll say, Nabil, it's too expensive for auction, and you'll appreciate it's a short conversation. But like you said before, there'll be times where an auction might have sold something more, the private treaty, and vice versa. So it just depends on the asset type. But the point you were making very well is that we've got a 3-week marketing period to get through 200-300 properties sold. And the first part of that is our experience in our mailing list. We've got over 100,000 subscribers to our mailing list, which in the auction world is huge. And then you advertise on the obvious things like portals, so Rightmove, Zoopers, all that kind of stuff. Advertise the auction on social media, all the rest of it. So we get a really lot of traction from doing that. But all that is a complete waste of time if the price is too high. As you all know, you'll look through our catalogue, that's fine. And if you look through another person's catalogue and it's too high, that's a very short trip to their catalogue, isn't it? Because it's too expensive. So we've got to that's the most powerful marketing tool I have, is the pricing.
And also from your point of view, from Allsop's point of view, you're market leader number 1 for a reason. You have the maximum conversion rate. You don't be an auctioneer where you've got, let's say, 100 lots and you've only sold 30%. It doesn't look good for your stats.
Yeah. Well, auctioneers, rightly or wrongly, and I think it's rightly, are often measured how good they are by the amount, how much they sell.
Yeah,
So
the stats basically.
But yeah, the stats, but the success rate,
Yeah.
which you're alluding to there, is key, because any agent can take on 1,000 properties.
Yes.
But if
But
you
they're
don't,
not selling it.
they're not selling, why would you want to use their services
Yeah.
and pay money? Because
Yeah.
auctioneers will charge you an upfront fee, it's time, lawyers will charge you for the legal pack. You'll be wasting a lot of money if you don't go with someone that gives you the right price and the right advice.
Correct.
And sometimes the right advice is, it's not for auction.
And if it's priced correctly, Richard, and you create all the interest, if you just get two people who want that same property and they bid with each other, they'll bring the price up anyway.
Absolutely.
That's a natural progression, demand and supply.
I mean, I often say to a lot of the sellers that aren't that familiar with auction is, if you imagine two reasonably identical properties, if you give me one priced at 100 and one priced at 200, the one for 100 will sell for more. Because that low pricing gets people excited, engaged.
Exactly.
They might get a deal, they might not, and that's what you want to do. You want to create that atmosphere to drive the price up.
And sometimes, Richard, in my career, when I felt courageous and bought something well, I actually put it with nil reserve.
Yeah.
And when I do that, people just go berserk, advertise nil reserve. They think they might get it for £10.
Exactly. It's very true. That is actually the purest way of doing it.
Yeah.
Let the market decide if you trust it, but you've got to be brave to do it, as you clearly were.
I'm seasoned at it, that's why I say it creates the interest, because I know people pay silly money for it.
Is nil reserve something you want to talk about in the podcast included?
It happens very rarely, doesn't it?
Yeah,
People
it's quite
expect-
Just say if it is manual, say what it is.
Do you want me to say?
Yeah.
I mean, for your listeners, if they're not familiar with that,
Yeah.
properties will have a reserve price, and that's the lowest it could be sold for. On the odd occasion, some sellers will set a reserve that is zero, i.e. the highest bid, £1 or more will buy it. But that can sometimes in itself, as Nabil mentions, generate huge interest, and you can put zero reserve on it, and it can sell for £1 million, depending on what it is. Yeah, trust the process and it will do that.
I bought a site in Cheshire, Trafford Park Hotel. I did that. I put it in Pure Company auction, sold it for big money.
Yeah.
It's completely run down.
Yeah.
A builder bought it. And
Yeah.
he probably thought he could do it cheaper.
Yeah.
So it's all about the location, how run down the property is really. Now, do you ever get any first-time buyers come to a property auction? Because that's very brave.
Yeah, no,
Unless they've got mummy and daddy's money,
the bank of mum and dad does come into play sometimes, and as I say, we sell for some housing associations all over the country, but some of the ones we sell for are in London, where it's a flat in Fulham, a flat in Shepherd's Bush. You will get some end users that do that. If you save up a good deposit, you can move fast, and then you can do it. So it does happen from time to time, but it's reasonably rare, I'd say. Probably if you ask me, if you press me on a proportion, I'd be surprised if there's more than 5-10% of our buyers throughout any given year would be end users.
Okay, and we've already spoken about this point, the risks and benefits of buying at auction. Risks are that you have to get the funding quick, benefit the deal's done quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else, Richard, you want to add on that?
No, I think the certainty point, I think the transparency point is that auctions are the most transparent way of buying a property. Everybody can see each other's bids, whether it's online or the phones, where it's going. So you've got competition. And actually, for a buyer, particularly in challenging markets, it's quite reassuring to know that you're paying just one increment more than the underbidder, rather than lots and lots over that level. And as I say, for both parties, that certainty of sale. But I've only got 3-4 weeks, I can be in and out. There's nothing worse as a buyer or seller to be going in, to a transaction for 3 months or 4 months and it to fall away. It's a lot of wasted time and energy. And an auction has less of that, and if you do get messed around, it happens quickly.
And also another question about reserve price, Richard. Whenever I dealt with auctioneers and auction companies across the country, they always say the reserve price has to be 10% within the guide price. Is that a guideline from the trading standards? Is that just a policy generally auction companies apply?
A very good question. It's very topical. First things first, I think, is the majority of sellers, you want to have a little bit of flexibility as to where you might set the reserve. Because you'd say to me, look, let's put it in £1 million and we'll set the reserve close to the time, depending on interest. So there's very often going to be a moving feast, if you like. The price might change a bit. But in answer to your question directly, a reserve price should not be more than 10% above a guide price.
Okay, so let's say if I had a property I was selling in central London and the guide price is £1 million, and then to the reserve can't really be more 1.1 or
can't be any more.
Okay.
It can't be any more than 1.1.
Either way,
it can be lower.
Yeah,
because that's fine. That's on you. But what that legislation is trying to deal with is what they call trading standards called bait pricing. Bait pricing being, I'm going to advertise it for 500,000. push the reserve up to 1 million. And all those people that spent money, putting petrol in the car to go and view it, do their legals, do all their DD, get their funding set up, never had a chance of buying it. And that's what it's trying to get rid of, and that's what it's trying to focus people's minds on, as being fair to the general public, and so it should be. But also, whilst having your interest, then look, we can't choose a reserve now, we haven't started marketing it, but within reason, it's 1 million-ish, so we'll guide 1 million, and if the reserve's 1,050,000, 1,010,000, then so be it.
Great. And also, Richard, when you measure the interest of a property, I measure it as a vendor, the number of legal pack downloads. Do you measure it from that, or do you measure it the number of people who viewed it? What's the best measure? I think the blueprint's legal pack downloads, because that separates the boys from the men. It
does. It's a good question, and that's one of those things. It kind of links into when we were talking about technology and how that's helped property. When I started, it would have been viewing numbers, then legal packs. You're right, there are two keys there. But you'll see trends. For instance, I've had things before where you've had 50 legal downloads, and no one's bid. You need to follow up on that. Is there a problem in the legals? There's an issue with the legal pack. Is there a fundamental issue there? So, but in direct answer to your question, legal packs are key because you're taking the time to do something. Yeah. I think viewings are quite important. I think the first thing people do, because it's free, it's online, is the legal packs. And then if you think, okay, there's no problems with it, there's no issues with it, I understand it, I'll make the effort of spending a few hours in the car and going to see it. But what we've got now, the beauty of our data now, is because buyers have to register, we can see who's registered on what properties. So I'd phone you up and say, Nabil, I've got 3 people registered, I'm holding funds from them. You're going to be absolutely fine. Wind back 10 years ago, that didn't exist. There was, auction room, I didn't know who was going to be. Yeah. Okay. The beauty for that as well, though, is is that I've then captured all the buyers. In the days of being in the room, if you'd walked in and someone started bidding really high, you might have walked out again. I wouldn't have been able to get hold of you. Whereas now, if I get a similar flat and a similar block, I phone you, you didn't buy this, do you want to buy this? And it just makes the market a lot more efficient.
And also, if somebody put something in auction that didn't sell it, and you had, let's say, 5 people who bid on it, the vendor might reduce the reserve, you know who to contact.
Exactly that. Absolutely right. Yeah. Absolutely right.
There's a trail, isn't there?
Yeah. And it makes us, we can be more efficient. We can be more efficient as agents, but we've got more information for you to be fully informed of what the market's doing.
One last question I've got for you, Richard, my friend, is Central London. Central London used to be on fire before. Now, because of the Russian money going out, we touched that with Scott as well. Now, Central London's only probably got about 10,000 buyers. Flats aren't selling as much due to high service charge, ground rent, the legislation changing about service charge. How are you finding that, selling properties? Because obviously I bought lots of properties from Allsop over the years in Central London, and now there's more opportunities for a buyer.
I think there is, but I agree with you. I think there are a number of reasons, a number of things that have happened in the past few years that put together have made an impact. And I think international money has underpinned central prime London for a long time. And whether it's Russia or China or other parts of the world that are no longer investing in it, that will have an impact. But that's come at a time whereby flats, leasehold reform, no one really knows what's going on. Costs of living crisis have gone up as well. So living in central London is an expensive place to live. Cladding, service charges, they've all gone up because of heating costs and maintenance costs. So all these things thrown into the melting pot.
And then working, like we said to Scott, working away from home. So you could work, let's say, an hour away from London, get a tube. Yep. You could have your family next to the parks. You don't need to come to central London.
Yeah, there's exactly as I say, that. Coupled with that, all put together, has probably had an impact on that. Having said that, if you speak to most agents in central London, and those that know it inside out, yourself included, there's a lot of value in it still. Yeah. It hasn't grown at the rate it traditionally has done in the past 5 years, for the reasons we've just said. But it's still one of the biggest and best cities in the world. And it's the gateway to America and the gateway to Europe. It's a pretty robust place.
I agree with that. It's a mature economy. Everybody wants a place. If you look at the American Embassy, which is now apartments, people paying £4,000 a square foot now. And you can buy a flat in a neighbouring building for £1,500 a square foot, people paying for the postcode. Yeah. So Richard, at the moment, as you're aware, HMO is a hot topic because obviously a lot of young people can't afford to rent a flat on their own. So somebody, let's say in London, might get a HMO in Finchley Road with 5 or 6 people living in it. There's an article in The Guardian recently where there's 160,000 people living in HMOs. What's your view on HMOs, and how do you think the next election, if Labour win, how will that change the HMO roadmap?
Gosh, it's a bit, I'm a crystal ball gazing there, I suppose, to a degree. It's predicting where we might go with it, but there's a few things there. I mean, HMOs have changed an awful lot in the past 20 years, and ultimately there's some really high quality HMOs out there. You would have seen them as sort of apartment hotels and some better quality ones, and there are out there all over the country some really good quality ones that will be servicing secondary students, if you like, young professionals, and then you can go further to other areas where there'll be sort of part-time workers, road workers, people that are moving around. I think the important point to point out is that not one HMO is the same as the other. There's licensing and regulation. There's good quality ones that are big, nice shared facilities, but like student accommodation with really high-end stuff. I think what you're alluding to is the poorer quality stuff that's out there and has been for a long time unlicensed. What do I think? It's a byproduct of the problem you and Scott were talking about, in that, you know, I can't remember a time when the government have hit targets on building. The time it takes to get any basic consents takes too long. And we've got a growing population for various reasons, through the way families are set up these days, a little bit of immigration and not building. And that means the pressure is on the housing market, and that has a byproduct of that is HMOs being tolerated, if you like. So the short-term solution is making them licensed and regulated and looking after them, making sure people live in good quality property. That's the short-term solution. And again, that falls on local governments to make sure they are inspecting these properties and dealing with people who are living in poor quality accommodation. It's unacceptable. That's not a long-term solution. The long-term solution is more property and more places.
Housing, basically the shorter
housing, and that's a byproduct of it. And I, you know, do we think it's acceptable for some, you know, people living in HMOs, poor quality ones that aren't licensed and regulated? No, it's not. But it's rife. You've seen it before. You see them all the time, people doing that. And until the government get a handle on that, whether it's local government, whether it's the national government, to actually get a handle on strategy and make sure people aren't living in squalor, it will continue. But the long-term solution is building more and getting things through planning so we can provide good quality housing to all sorts of people.
I totally agree. That's a macroeconomic point of view, to provide more housing.
Yeah.
But in the short term, Richard, I think the government should have like inspectors to check, because I've seen lots of programs, and I know about this, lots of illegal HMOs exist where landlords don't pay the licence fee, £1,500 per unit. They don't have all the regulations, for example, the fire-resistant strips around the doors, fire extinguishers, fire-resistant flooring, because they want to save money and make money. People are quite selfish landlords.
Yeah. We see that all the time. I think the trouble is, then, Bill, and I agree with you entirely, is it's easier said than done. And actually that comes down to a local, you know, if you spoke to a local authority about it, they would say, well, we haven't got sufficient funding to have enough inspectors to make this right. And it's just, all it is funding and money and building, and it all comes in, it feeds into the same problem.
God forbid, if there was a fire in an illegal HMO, landlords don't understand, so I like to make it clear, if there's a fire and somebody died, innocent person, they'll be done for manslaughter. So my advice to anybody who's listening, and you've got a HMO, follow the law, do it properly.
I couldn't agree more. I think morally and you know, you must do the right thing. Right.
Don't cut corners. That's the one. Richard, HMOs, it's a hot topic. So lots of people get a small house, try and convert to HMO, and they'll put it in your auction. So they'll sell it as an income stream. So obviously property value, as you're aware, is predominantly driven by the income when you're selling an investment property. So when somebody says, I'm selling an HMO in your auction, do you then check all the legislation, make sure they've got the license, make sure it's all, they've got the fire certificate? Do you check all that, or just let them blindly put it in the auction?
I mean, the first point there is that during the conversation we have, you alluded to it earlier, in the what's the first thing you do? Someone phones you, they want a price for a property. That unravels quite quickly.
Yes.
And if they say, I've got a property in, I'll give you an example, a property in Peterlee, or property in Burnley that I know is worth £30,000.
Or Leytonstones.
Whatever it might be, but I roughly know what the bricks and mortar values are there, because we sell them a lot. If someone said to me, I've got this house, it's, you know, I know it's worth £50,000, and they want £100,000 because the income is £15,000, £20,000. This happens all the time, and the conversation is a very short one. You know, the residential market and lenders will not lend you more than the vacant possession value of the building.
Of course.
Okay, so the point I raised that first of all is that's when the conversation often stops, and that's the end of that, and they go away. Investors won't pay unless they're daft. You know, won't pay over and above what the property's worth in terms of bricks and mortar value. If you're getting a very high income, or it appears to be, there'll be a reason for that. It's like yield is risk. You know, are the tenants going to stay? Are you have to spend a lot of the money doing it up? Are you going to get a full year's rent? All those questions. But in answer to your second part of that question is that we write to the solicitors acting for a buyer saying, you're duty bound to disclose all the information you have or you don't have. So if it isn't licensed and it isn't regulated, then we need to know that. So we certainly wouldn't knowingly purport a property to be a registered HMO and regulated as such if it wasn't.
One experience I've got from HMOs, I used to have a lot, is a lot of people think it's really cool owning HMOs, but it's very intense management. So you've got, say you've got a building with 6 tenants, you've got 6 individual tenants to chase for payment, you've got all the repairs, so it's not that easy as it looks. People think it's great having HMOs, but it's quite intense management.
Well, you've hit me on the head and you've got the experience of it. They are management intensive. So your headline rents, your gross rents will probably net back quite heavily because you've got to pay someone to collect the rents, do the maintenance, do the repairs, fill the voids when tenants move out. It's you need to know what you're doing.
Yeah, because we've got a lot of experience, yourself, myself, Scott, between us, we've got 90 years experience, so we know what we do.
Yeah, we do think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. But a lot of people think, especially the younger generation, get a house, HMO it, and we get lots of rental income, but it's a lot of headache. Oh, my heating's not working. Oh, this is a problem. Oh, I've had a fallout with my flatmates. Oh, I've had an argument with them.
Well, as you alluded to earlier, it's a big responsibility being a landlord.
Exactly.
So you take it seriously.
That's great, Richard. So I must thank you for your time. We've covered everything on the residential auction aspect. I must thank Scott for your time as well. It's an honour and pleasure to have you on the Bricks to Riches podcast.
Thanks for having us.
And I look forward to getting the next property deal with you guys.
Thanks. Likewise.